All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. I am happy to be moderating the fifth discussion in the webinar series of the Youth at Work, which has been a series of 6 webinars to promote evidence-based policy making, experts knowledge sharing, and good practices on youth employment in Africa. My name is Chiamaka Nwachukwu, and I'll be moderating today's session, which will be focusing on youth at work and focusing on the enabling environment. Last week, we had a conversation on policies and government actions. The week before that, we had a conversation on conflicts and crisis. And before that, we had a conversation on the rural economy. And the very first webinar was focused on the green economy. And each discussion has been more insightful than the last. Each webinar presents one major synthesis paper, which was commissioned by Include in the spotlight, and the evidence synthesis papers are the outcome of a partnership boosting decent employment for Africa's youth, consisting of Include's Canada's International Development Research Center and the International Labour Organization under the aegis of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. And after the evidence synthesis paper, we have discussions and conversations from policy experts, young people, and then from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well to weigh in on the discussion topic for that day. So I am glad that we are having this conversation today, and we do have a lot of very insightful speakers lined up today. But before I introduce them, I'd like to first of all start with the general house rules. So the first one is that the webinar is being recorded, and parts of the recording will be used on Include social media and websites. Secondly, please raise your hand to speak and you'll be unmuted. There are specific periods where questions and comments will be allowed. So when those periods are there, you can raise your hand to speak and you will be unmuted. And finally, please leave your questions or comments in the Q&A section or in the chat, and we will collect them and address them in the time allocated to clarification questions. I hope all of that has been gotten clearly. So right now, I will start by introducing our speakers for today. We do have a lot of very impactful speakers lined up. And the first person who will be speaking today is Professor Chibuike Uche, who is the chairholder of the Stephen Ellis Chair for Governance and Integrity in Africa. And he has extensive research experience in Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone in the fields of political economy, business and financial history, financial institutions regulation, and regional integration. And the second speaker for today will be Marieke Meeske. She will be presenting the evidence synthesis paper, and she's an impact measurement and knowledge specialist at Oxfam Novib, and her work centers on supporting teams in Oxfam to evaluate the impact of their interventions and to inform their programs and campaigns with evidence-based recommendations. And then the third speaker we're going to be having, that's the first batch of speakers, is Taonga Zulu. Taonga Zulu is a 25-year-old Zambian woman with 3 years volunteer and professional experience in working with people, both young and old, from various backgrounds. She's currently the board publicity secretary for Young Women in Action and Regional Young Women's Network secretary on ending child marriages in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi NGOCC. So these are our first 3 speakers, and after they finish speaking, we're going to have clarification questions, and then we can go on to the next batch of speakers. So I'll now like to hand over the floor to Chibuike, who will be taking the first presentation, and he will be talking about the features in political economy and financial regulations that can constitute an enabling environment for youth employment in sub-Saharan Africa. You have the floor now, and you have 10 minutes.
Fund it.
Great.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to go first. So essentially what I'm going to do today in 10 minutes is I'm going to look at the role of multinational businesses in creating employment opportunities in Africa. And I will do this in 10 minutes. And essentially I will be borrowing a lot from some of the research we have done at the Africa Study Center in this area. And we'll be looking at local and foreign multinational companies in Africa. So for today, there are three main arguments we will make. First of all, we'll show the link between investments and employment in Africa. And then we'll show that also Africa, despite the fact that it is the poorest continent, is actually a net exporter of capital. Okay, then finally, we will also argue that there is very little difference between the behavior of local and foreign multinational companies in Africa. And then we will conclude by giving a few suggestions on the way forward. So the first thing we will look at, essentially, we'll look at the link between investment and employment. In economics, I think it's clearly agreed that savings is usually used in investments, which can also lead to employment and economic growth. Okay, so in the absence of savings, like countries with low propensity to save, like in Africa, they can either borrow or depend on development aid. And this should actually lead to economic growth. That is the general expectation. Okay, but in Africa, of course, the dynamics are slightly different. So what we'll look at is, if you look at multinational businesses, for instance, which play a key role, and we will argue today in the second section, that this is the most important sector in African economic development and, of course, employment. We will show that the markets for multinational investments, for instance, how do they determine where to invest? And there's a market, and a lot of policies they consider. They look at tax policies, they look at the labor availability, they look at research and development, and then they also look at markets, two kinds of markets. They look at market for finished products, also they look at market for raw materials. And then also they look at the ease of doing business in that particular jurisdiction. So this influences how the decisions of multinational companies to invest or not to invest in diverse localities. And these characteristics also influence how these multinational companies invest in value chains, okay, which is important. In fact, most of the employment is done along the value chains, and we can also look at this from two simple examples. We look at two Dutch multinational companies in Africa. We look at Heineken and we look at Friesland Campina. Okay, so they go to Heineken. Okay, so if you look at Heineken, for example, they produce beer, and they produce beer from barley. So their major raw material is barley. So their value chain is actually barley, their main value chain. So, but if you come to Africa, they don't produce barley. So if they continue with production of barley, then they're externalizing their value chain. So the jobs for the production of Heineken in Africa is created in Europe and other jurisdictions, not in Africa. So, but we know that beer can be brewed from local grain, for instance, like sorghum. So what is happening now is that Heineken is changing to using sorghum, and they're also helping create high variety of sorghum seeds. That is creating huge employment opportunities in the agricultural industry. We also look at Friesland Campina. Okay, they produce milk, of course. So if the initial model is bring powdered milk from Europe, from Australia, put water in and sell it in Africa. But that is also gradually changing, not as fast as Heineken, but because also in Africa, we also have cows, and we have about 20 million cattle herds compared with, say, the Netherlands with about less than 8 million cattle herds. So, but despite this, only the local raw material presently is about 3% of, so that tells a lot about dairy farm jobs in Africa, for instance. That can be improved, and Friesland Campina is also working towards these kinds of improvement. So value change is important in creating, for labor. So the second point we're going to make today is that we're going to look at, we're going to show that Africa is actually a net exporter of capital. So if this is using the global justice data, in 2015, for instance, Africa actually exported about 41 billion capital. So the poorest continent actually exports capital. But what is striking is for you to see the role of businesses in this. And we essentially argue that, look, businesses are the major exporters of capital. So if you look at the table, for instance, if you look at the table, for instance, in terms of capital exports, money leaving Africa, the two major players are actually businesses, what businesses legitimately take abroad. And then the second one is, of course, is what businesses illegitimately, illicit financial flows. Of course, some of it comes from African corruption in Africa, but the consensus is that most of it, about 70, 80%, actually is because of the businesses. Okay, so what they actually take abroad. And then if you now look at, you compare it, what we will do in the next slide, for instance, is to, for want of time, to simply compare it with what actually enters, what actually enters the continent in terms of capital. So look at this multinational profits. In that year, for instance, 32 billion was exported legitimately by multinational businesses as dividends abroad. Okay, compare it with net foreign direct investments into Africa. It was about more than two times net foreign direct investments in Africa. Then you compare it with OECD official aid to Africa, it was about 1.699 times that. Then also compare it with inward remittances. It was about, that is Africans working abroad and sending money back to Africa. This was about 1.04 times, and it was roughly the same thing with loans to government. So you can see businesses play a huge role in this direction. But then one thing you should do, try and compare it, look at illicit financial flows. This is things that, money that go out illicitly, maybe transfer pricing, over invoicing, round tripping. And most of this is alluded to businesses, what businesses do. And then the figures get even more dramatic. If you look at it, for instance, in that year, for instance, it was about 4.28 times net foreign direct investment. So all the talks about foreign direct investments are about 4.28 times that. So, and if you also compare it to OECD official aid, it's about 3.54 times in that year. So clearly, what we've tried to establish is that businesses are central. They play a key central role in the fact that Africa is a major exporter of capital. Okay, so, but this is, and how is this actualized? And we'll show you, for instance, something like part of the research we've done at the Africa Studies Center to see why is this. This is Friesland Campina, their dividend policy in Nigeria over a period from the 80s to 2000s. For instance, you could see in the later parts, for instance, for almost 15 years, on the average, it was 100% dividend payouts. And essentially, they justify this. And indeed, this is justified because Africa is a high-risk place to do business. So all cash is exported abroad. And we will also argue that there is no difference between Friesland Campina and even local multinational businesses in Africa. So when we are looking at creating jobs, the whole argument is to look at internally for solutions rather than externally for solutions. The solutions may actually lie within Africa. Then one other thing we'll look at also, okay, so we'll now have the third point we are going to make for our presentation is we'll look at the difference between local and foreign multinational businesses. And essentially here we argue that there's very little difference between the two. Okay, so in terms of behavior, for instance, businesses, when they go to jurisdictions without competent labor, they simply import labor. And whether it's local, whether it's Friesland Campina, and we use the example here, one of the studies we've done at the Africa Studies Center is the Dangote Group, which is a big cement conglomerate. And it's one of the biggest conglomerates in Africa. And it's a local Nigerian multinational. And essentially, they are currently building a refinery worth about $15 billion in Nigeria. And it is estimated in some circles that they've imported about 30,000 expatriates to help construct this refinery. And the employment scheme is also tending towards importing expatriate personnel. So this tells you something about labor. It's important, and this is an argument that has been trending on this platform, that availability of competent local labor is important for creating opportunities for local. If not, the jobs will be exported abroad. And it has nothing to do with multinationals. Then the same thing goes for infrastructural deficits. Again, when there's infrastructural deficits, multinationals simply exploit local markets, And then this leads to oligopoly and monopolies. And this is clear if you look at what is also playing out in the cement business. It is difficult, for instance, to export cement from Africa to that continent. So that's one of the major problems you will see. Then another issue, and this is the final issue, then I think I will stop. If you look at operational risks, and let me give you a clear example, something like currency devaluation. If you look at currency devaluation, most African countries in the last 5 years have lost, several have lost at least 25, 50% of their currency value. This is unstable for multinational business practices. So what you have is capital flight occurring at private level and official level. And if you look at the previous Friesland Campina table, it says, okay, exporting about 100% of its dividends, of its profits, declaring it as dividend. That's also, if you look at also from our research in the Dangote group, for instance, we show that Dangote now plans to have 60% of its entire investments in Europe and Americas by the year 2025. Okay, so that is huge. Okay, so instead of being a local champion now, it's now looking at, and it's clearly making it clear, look, the problem is the safety. How do we safeguard our investments? And that is the major issue. So, so the point, in summary, essentially, the point, we've tried to make 3 points, for instance, in this meeting, for instance, and in conclusion, what I think the issue is we should be clear about is that multinationals are important in creating jobs in Africa, and that is possible, but they cannot create it except the local conditions are encouraging for them to do that. And when that does not happen, most jobs are simply exported out of Africa. And we've also shown that multinationals are indeed the biggest players when it comes to exporting capital out of Africa. And we've clearly shown also that if you look at the data, the statistics, no matter how you talk about foreign direct investments helping Africa grow, what businesses take out by far exceed what the so-called foreign aid to Africa. It also exceeds the foreign direct investments into Africa. But of course, finally, we've also shown that the three, whether it's multinational businesses based abroad or based locally, they all dance to the tune of the local economic space. If there is no good labor workforce, cheap labor workforce, they all go abroad to get their labor. If the economy, local economy is not stable, they all consider it as an unstable environment and they all export their capital in order to safeguard the value of their businesses. So in conclusion, my argument today, based on the research we have done at the Africa Studies Center, is that change can come to Africa, but it will come from the inside and from internal government policies, not necessarily from free market policies. And I think I can stop now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chibuike, for that presentation. Now we'll be moving on to Marieke, who is one of the authors of the evidence synthesis paper to be making her presentation. Marieke, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiamaka. I would like to share my screen, but then I think, yeah, Chibuike should stop sharing first. Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, so I'm assuming you can see my screen, and thanks also for making the introduction. So I'm Marieke, I'm working for Oxfam Novib, and I have the honor to present this paper that I wrote together with other colleagues in Oxfam on how empowerment and enabling environment matter for the effectiveness of youth employment programs. Yeah, and I started straight away with the objective. So yeah, at Oxfam we believe to tackle all the constraints that youth face in order to have decent employment, that we should take a holistic approach, and next to like, for instance, skills development or other supplier demand driven interventions, that we should also focus on empowerment and the enabling environment. So the objective of this paper really was to understand how a focus on empowerment and the enabling environment matters for the effectiveness of youth employment programs in Africa. And yeah, this was operationalized by 3 research questions. So the first one really looks at individual empowerment. So how is that operationalized in youth employment programs? And yeah, can we see positive change? The second question, yeah, similar, but then focus on the enabling environment. So how is it operationalized, and can we see positive change? And in the third question, we combine both concepts and we look at yeah, at the added value. So do programs that have this explicit focus on empowerment and the enabling environment, do they add value in terms of the more traditional outcomes of these programs in terms of business, business and employment outcomes? And yeah, so basic methodology, we did a rapid evidence assessment. So that's basically a structured literature search of both academic and grey literature. And findings from this literature search, we discussed and reflected upon them together with the sounding board. That's basically a group of practitioners from CSOs, from youth movements, youth activists. And we have one of our sounding board members also present in this webinar, Taonga. Yeah, so we checked, we validated basically the findings from the literature with them. Yeah, and there are some study limitations that I already like to mention now. So we looked at the literature that evaluates youth employment programs with a focus on enabling environment or empowerment, and basically that is we only found limited studies, and especially limited in the sense of those studies that also have like a more quasi-experimental impact design and focus on Africa. So we had quite some considerations in our search for literature. And another point good to mention now is that there's a huge variety, of course, in the types of in different types of youth employment programs, in their setup, in their types of interventions, but also in the people that they target, the context, of course, but also in the way they are evaluated. So therefore, it was really difficult or even impossible to make an accurate comparison between the effectiveness of one program and the other. So therefore, we decided in the paper to focus more on or the direction of the change in these programs, rather than really look at the magnitude of the different types of impacts. Yeah, so that is a side note. Let me start briefly with explaining the two most important concepts of this paper. So that is empowerment and the enabling environment. So empowerment, it's formulated mostly at the individual level, and in the paper we operationalized it by looking at both social empowerment, so that's more autonomy and confidence of people, and economic empowerment, focusing more on agency and someone's capacity to make independent choices in life. And the second concept, enabling environment, is really about the systemic influences that are beyond the individual sphere. And here we operationalized it by looking at both informal factors of the enabling environment. So that's, for instance, social norms, attitudes, peer pressure, and formal aspects of the enabling environment, for instance, are policies or legislation, like the regulatory environment. And in that picture, so the enabling environment is then formulated more at the society level. So that is on concept. So some of the findings related to empowerment. First of all, the studies that we included in this paper, they have really a greater focus on social empowerment compared to economic empowerment. And in relation to social empowerment, we find positive effects, for instance, in the individual level. So improvements of self-esteem, improvements of well-being, life skills, but also improvements at the collective level of social empowerment. So that's more, for instance, expanded social networks, or improved or more respect or recognition at the community level. So we discussed these findings with the sounding board, and from that discussion, it actually became clear that, according to them, social empowerment really is like a prerequisite also for economic empowerment. So it was mentioned that people need to have at least some confidence, some certain level of well-being before they can develop their agency, to develop their economic independence. So that was a finding that was discussed, and linked to this, it was also mentioned that social empowerment is also really instrumental in building the more harder skills, harder outcomes of employment programs. So for instance, skills of youth, but also the employment or business outcomes. Concluding that for youth employment programs, focus on empowerment can be helpful, especially when working with more disadvantaged groups who have even more barriers or intersecting barriers to employment. Yeah, so the second concept that we focused on was really the enabling environment, and studies included in this paper, they had a larger focus really on the informal side of the enabling environment. So that was more like the social norms, attitudes aspects than the formal factors. And within informal factors, it was often operationalized in relation to gender equity. So for instance, intra-household decision-making or social norms around unpaid care work. And when we look at the impact of those programs on the enabling environment, we find really a mixed picture. So some studies, they show some positive impacts in the short run, for instance, on changes in gender empowerment. But we also saw that these positive impacts, they tend to fade away a bit in the long run. So that points also to the difficulty of changing social norms permanently. Formal aspects of the enabling environment were discussed in less detail in the studies or literature that we analyzed. And when studies do mention formal aspects, it's mostly, these studies itself, they are mostly not related to youth employment interventions explicitly. So they focus more on the labor market in general. And this also, related to this, the sounding board mentioned that in their opinion, there's also really a disconnect between, for instance, the formulation of policies and programs, like the formal formulations at the government level, the implementation, but also the relationship with activities of NGOs. So it's basically different actors working at different level on the same topic. So this is, according to them, also really a missed opportunity of in boosting decent employment for youth. Lastly, all this, the studies, but also practitioners, they mentioned the importance of recognizing heterogeneity of youth. So different youth have different opportunities, different barriers, and it's really important to acknowledge that and to a minimum also adopt a gender lens. When working on youth employment, especially when working on the informal environment, because the social norms are different generally for different groups of people. And so our last question really looked at the added value of those programs that explicitly have this focus on empowerment or the enabling environment, or both. And what we found basically, I want to stress just again that we couldn't directly compare the effectiveness of one program to the other due to the limitations I already mentioned. But in general, we found that the programs that do have this focus on empowerment or the enabling environment, they manage to improve the more traditional business and employment outcomes, at least to a similar extent as the programs that don't have this explicit focus on enabling environment. And the sounding board really said this was remarkable, because often these programs with this focus on enabling environment, they tend to target more disadvantaged youth. So in their opinion, they would have expected more limited results because you're working with a more disadvantaged group. But so they were really excited about this finding, that the still positive changes also in employment and business outcomes are found for these programs. So all in all, we can say that programs that have this focus on empowerment and enabling environment, they next to still ensuring results on the business and employment outcomes, they also help youth in overcoming some of the barriers that they face, social barriers that they face to the labor market. Yeah, lastly, based on these findings, we formulated some policy recommendations. And the first one really focused on empowerment. So this is what I just mentioned already. So it's useful if programs focus on empowerment, especially when working with disadvantaged youth, because it helps them to overcome some of their barriers to the labor market. Secondly, it's important to recognize the diversity among youth. So different youth have different opportunities, different constraints. And when recognizing that, you can also better tailor your interventions to these different needs. And to a minimum, programs should adopt this gender lens. Third, important to acknowledge, account for, and aim to shift social norms. So even though it's really important to, it's difficult to change social norms sustainably, it's still important to focus on them because they really, impact or restrict people sometimes in their access to the labor market. So it's important that that programs consider this. And lastly, it's important to also include a focus on the formal side. So we saw that this focus is not implemented in all programs, but next to focusing on the informal side, to also focus on the formal side, it will also help in bridging the gap between the demand and the supply side of labor market interventions that we often see, as was also actually discussed in the webinar last week. But so this very briefly, this was my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Marieke, for the presentation. And finally, we will have Taonga, who will now be making her presentation. Please let's try to stick to 10 minutes so that we can have all the presentations and questions today. So Taonga, you have the floor now.
Thank you. I think for starters, I'd like to mention that it's very important to note that there's a very big difference between the employment rate amongst women and the employment rate amongst men. I think for women, it's relatively higher than the unemployment rate for men in my country. Gender biasness when it comes to employment of young men in the country. From personal experience, what I have noticed is the things that they consider when employing young women is they look at the fact that a woman is very likely to fall pregnant between the ages of 22 to 55. A woman is very likely to want to start a family, meaning she won't be always able to spend overtime at the workplace or continuously be available on weekends. Another thing I've noticed that could be one of the reasons for the gender dimension amongst youths in the country is that there is unequal access to education. Most women and girls in my country don't have as much access to education in the country, especially those in rural areas. You find it could simply be because of social norms or poverty, which contribute to these different aspects. And then it could be that young women don't have access to employment because of teenage pregnancies, early child marriages. So because of their position, they can't be employed. And also teenage pregnancies also adds on to the fact that these women are less likely to access education. And then sometimes it's an issue of little or no access to opportunity or platforms that actually provide for them to receive an education or capacity building genders in the country. And I've also noticed that unsafe abortions play a role in the employment rate of young women in the country, because mostly it puts them in a position to not be able to attend work, to go for work. It also makes them more vulnerable. And we also have a lot of young women who are afraid to work in certain spaces because they don't feel it's safe, or because the only way to get certain jobs is through favors. They can only get those particular positions if they sleep with the boss or if they get into a particular type of relationship with the boss. And yes, that is one of the things to note. And then what is an enabling environment for young women in Zambia? I think an enabling environment would be that there would be increased access to opportunities, that's equal opportunities for not only young women, but also youths. Because one of the things that I have noted in my work is that most youths look good on paper. Many organizations only engage youths when it comes to how the papers are going to look when presenting these papers to donors. But then when it comes to key positions, the youths are left behind. They're actually put in the back bench seats, or they're just put into the lower positions, not key positions. Though I'd like to mention that the new government, things are looking good for us. And then I think one of the other things that I would like to talk about is that it would be very important for us as a country to have policies that actually curb gender biases in the workplace, policies around sexual harassment, gender policies, and safeguarding policies, especially for women and youths. And I think another thing that we would have to consider is that usually when you go to corporate places, they have more young men in the spaces than young women. So these policies would really help in ensuring that we have more women in the workplace, and they would really help in ensuring that more young women and women themselves are considered for these positions. My recommendation would be that they should ensure that there is a meaningful integration of women and youths in key decision-making positions. I hope that was within 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much, Taonga, and thank you to all our speakers. I do have a lot of questions already lined up for you. So I will just go, we're going to just take out 10 minutes to have a few clarifying questions. If anyone else in the audience has questions for our speakers, you can just put it in the chat, and then we are going to collate the questions and answer them. So my first question is to Chibuike, and the question goes, how could or should policies address and change these financial flows in order to create more employment? So the question again is, how could or should policies address and change these financial flows in order to create more employment? And then while answering, it would be great if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about how the tie-in of how you described the way money flows and the business side of the discussion surrounding employment and how multinationals are investing money and how it relates to the economic environment in those countries and how it can be exploited in order to create more employment, especially for young people. So I think that would be a good way for us to start.
Yes, are you hearing me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so my understanding of the question is what kind of policies can be put in place to ensure that these financial flows are reversed, right? That's my understanding of the question. And essentially what I tried to explain was this. If you look at investments as a market, and essentially people in a market pursue the best deals they can get. Okay, so if there's competition for any product, for instance, you supply it to the person who provides the highest opportunities for that kind of product. So the point is if there's limited capital and multinationals have to invest abroad, then the question African countries will ask themselves is, how can we attract this kind of funds? And one of the ways to do it is to ensure, one, that you have sound labor force. You have a sound labor force. That helps. Look, from the research we've done at the Africa Studies Center, we've come to the conclusion, and this is our view, that multinationals simply go to the territories where they find cheap labor that will enable them make more profits. So we do not see any evidence of this so-called correlation between multinationals and collusion in their home states. They are simply pursuing for profit. So, and I gave you a clear example of, look at Dangote, for instance. You are building a 15 billion refinery and you have to import 30,000 expatriate labor. That shows that there's a dearth of trained manpower locally. And that will not be fixed by a multinational company. It has to be fixed by a local company. And I'll give you another example. Let us look at the Friesland, let us look at multinationals, let us look at Heineken, for instance. Heineken brews beer. Okay, so the beer they know to brew, they brew from barley, which is grown in the West. But we also know that beer can be brewed from local grain. So in Africa, for instance, you can use rice, you can use you can use sorghum. But if Heineken comes to Africa to produce beer and the government does not have enough sorghum supply, then what is the attraction for Heineken to begin to grow the local sorghum? Its expertise is not in sorghum. But if you do it the Singapore or Malaysian way and say, look, let us do it this way. We'll provide you the local sorghum. We have an abundant supply. Use our local sorghum. And it's cheaper for them instead of importing the beer. They will, of course, importing barley. They will, of course, use the local product. So sometimes I think the problem is we must develop policies that enable multinational companies to use our local labor in order to do their businesses. If you don't do that, then they are only interested in Africa as a market for raw material, a market for finished products. Okay, in that way, they do not invest in the value chain, and the jobs are created in the value chain. This is one aspect of the answer. There's also another aspect of it. Sometimes, for instance, I'll give you an example. The Western governments can have a role to play, but it's all negotiations. Okay, so if you look at cocoa beans, for instance, if you're exporting cocoa beans from Africa to the West, it comes here at no tariffs. But once you process it and export, there's additional tariffs. So the structure also encourages export of raw cocoa beans. So if you're exporting raw cocoa beans, so you have the chocolate industry. Between Ghana and Ivory Coast, they produce 60–70% of the cocoa in the world. Yet in the chocolate industry, they take care of less than 10% of the benefits of the cocoa industry. So the value chains have to be developed locally, but that has to depend on infrastructure and, of course, discussions with Western governments to also enable them to be able to export cocoa that has value added in Africa to the West without much encumbrances. Does that help?
Yes, I think you have made some very important points. And then it's important to note that as much as we are trying to push for policies, it's also important to understand that a lot of private companies are pushed by profits, not necessarily any particular loyalty to anyone or any cause or anything. So it's in the best interest of countries to make sure that they create local solutions that will maximize profit for the multinationals, as well as make sure that there is investment in their own value chain locally. So I think that that's a very good way of looking at this. The next question I have is for Marieke. And the question is, what could be the policies that could ensure the empowering and enabling environment that you described as instrumental to employment and entrepreneurship? So what are the specific policies that could ensure that this empowering and enabling environment what are some of these policies as instrumental to employment or entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thanks. Let me start with, because I find it difficult to mention the policies because in this paper we didn't, it was really an analysis of the youth employment programs mainly implemented by NGOs, not so much the policies itself. But I think what would be key to mention here is the importance of considering the participation of youth and in all its representation in formulating these policies. So that is for me a key starting point to make sure that they are involved in specifying what is enabling for them and what is constraining them, but what are opportunities for them? And I think that is key in any policy development that will add to the enabling environment. Yeah, that's only a partial answer. Maybe I can invite other colleagues, maybe Saskia or Ronna, to add to that if they have something to say on that.
Yes, I can add maybe a bit that, as we pointed out already in our last recommendation point, that it's very important to bridge the gap between the practice that is often like the programs that are started to support youth employment and the policy makers, because now these two worlds are two distinct worlds that are not enough in contact, maybe, which was also stressed by our sounding board. So I think that is the most important thing in developing policies, to do that together with the demand side of the labor market, of course, so that the policies are also taken up in the private sector area, but also with the NGOs that are supporting youth employment for marginalized groups, and that may play a role in the implementation or in supporting the implementation of employment policies.
All right, thank you so much, Saskia. So I have one question for Taonga, and then we can move on to the next batch of speakers. So for Taonga, Zambia has witnessed a new change or a transition in government, and I'd like to know if you feel like there has been any considerable move or action by the new government, or I mean even by the previous one, but any concrete example of something that has been supporting or creating an enabling environment to be able to support more youth employment in Zambia?
I think there has been a very big change, or something that has actually brought about more youth employment in the country. That would be the founding of the Ministry of SMEs, that's small and medium enterprises in the country. So with the founding of that particular ministry, it's brought about a shift in the country. We've seen more youths begin to open up businesses, legal businesses, not just internet businesses. So we've seen more registering businesses, opening up businesses, and there's been better and improved access to the empowerment funds in the country, because there's been an increase in accountability, and because of the very fact that now we have who to turn to. We have a specific ministry for SMEs in the country. It's easier for youths to create employment, not only for themselves, but for fellow youths as well. I hope I've answered your question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Taonga, and thank you to all our first three speakers. So now we'll be moving on to the final two speakers, and then we can have some more discussions before we have to close today. So the first person that will be speaking is Laila. Laila is a policy advisor for youth employment and the future of work, with special attention paid towards meaningful youth participation at the Department for Sustainable Economic Development at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the second is Abdellah Mallek. He is the founder and manager of Sylabs, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, an entrepreneurship and technology hub in Algeria. So Laila would first of all be speaking, and then she's going to be speaking on the reflections on the paper and presentation of the Dutch Ministry's role and policies. And then Abdellah will be telling us some things about what's the work of Sylabs in Algeria. So Laila, you have the floor now. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was quite a mouthful, but thank you for the introduction. And thank you for having me today. So I'm currently based in Tunisia. I'm working for the Dutch embassy here in Tunis temporarily. And what strikes me when I talk to young people and smallholder farmers in Tunisia is the huge role of regulations and law in order for them to thrive and conduct business in Tunisia, as the government here is regulating prices, for example, of the price of milk or wheat. And one of the entrepreneurs I spoke to, she's an agri-tech entrepreneur, she said, Laila, sometimes it's better to stay in the informal industry, informal economy, than formalize. And we as donors should really focus on education and agriculture, as people need to be fed physically with food, but also fed mentally with knowledge. So that's something that I'm taking away from my brief time here. But apart from laws, the enabling environment has also a lot to do with efficient and effective enforcement, right? As well as having well-designed and documented laws, regulations, and frameworks. And what promotes efficient and effective enforcement, to my mind, are basically 4 factors in general. That is, one, we need an inclusive and participatory process involving all relevant stakeholders, including meaningful youth participation, whether that's at policy level, at the government, or at programmatic level. I think that's key. We need widespread dissemination and understanding as well of content of laws and frameworks and regulations. Language is important, and it should be accessible and understood by everyone. We need an effective system as well to guarantee its enforcement. It's nice to have laws, but it should also be enforced. And lastly, I think it's also important to have a vigilant civil society to also oversee the above factors, which I just mentioned. So let me turn to the theme of partnership and collaboration, as I believe that everyone has a role to play in the enabling environment. So I think governments, such as the Netherlands, but also national governments in particular, most important, must put in place the right enabling frameworks through developing effective public policy. I think that's key. Secondly, I think that civil society, but also academia, can galvanize public pressure and draw on the expertise of local communities and generate new insights for our challenges or our policies, such as this webinar series is doing. The private sector, I would say, can apply business solutions to local complex problems, innovating with new technologies and creating jobs and livelihoods. And then in particular, I would like to focus on MSMEs, so micro, small, medium enterprises, as those have got the most potential in order to generate a lot of jobs. And young people, although not a homogeneous group, of course, they must be active citizens and given the space to raise their voice. And we should all listen and act upon it. So our actions shape their prospects, so they're entitled a seat at the table. And I want to really put the emphasis at the same table and not the table in another room, which unfortunately we often still see. So I fully agree with the 3 presenters before me that we should also focus on empowerment, focus on the gender divide, which has been discussed, and also strengthening the life skills. And just to mention that, I work for the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and coming Monday, so the 22nd of November, we will launch our own Meaningful Youth Participation Toolkit and Youth Advisory Committee, to help policymakers such as myself in The Hague, but also abroad, on how to involve young people better in our policies, in our programs, and also recognize their diversity among youth to improve our targeting and policies. So if you have the time, please do attend. We are still learning. We are still learning, but this is a first step in the right direction, I would say. So I'm quite glad that we've taken that step. I also heard something about the match. So the match between the skills of the worker and the job. I think that's a crucial point. It matters. It's not just lack of jobs, quantity, but it's also about the quality of jobs, but also the rights. The education system needs to respond to any mismatch between the skills being taught and the skills that businesses, for example, need. And we need to understand how the nature of work is changing as well, and how well the matched people looking for work are to the jobs available and to the jobs that will be available in the future. So one of our programs, the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment, but also LEAD, so Local Employment for African Development Program, is really trying to focus on the skills mismatch and also trying to formalize, certain jobs that are currently taking place in the informal sector. I know that in 2 weeks' time, the 6th webinar of Include will take place on the future of work. And to my mind, all these webinars are, of course, interlinked. But I wanted to make a quick reference to it, as you cannot see it apart with the enabling environment, is that the future of work is upon us. And while we've been entrenched at home, the world has been changed significantly, and apart from the gender disparity, we are also facing the digital gap that's been increasing between and within countries. And success in the future will also be determined about the skills one possesses. So in this more increasingly digital world, that in one way means the digital skills you have, but more importantly, the soft skills one has. So no matter how old or how young you are, never stop learning. Lifelong learning is key to tackle constant changes and challenges. And I'm really happy that the research of Oxfam has addressed this key element. And I'm sure the team of Future of Work will be elaborated more in 2 weeks' time. But quite pleased to hear the current findings of the research. And I think my time is up, so I've held your attention for long enough. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Laila, and thank you especially for mentioning, because I mean, if you didn't mention, I was going to ask how exactly young people had been involved in this process, but then you beat me to it and mentioned that there's a youth advice, and this is important because at the end of the day, as I think we have tried to reiterate at every single webinar, you cannot have any meaningful discussion on employment for young people or the future of work for young people without actually having young people there to talk about it. So thank you for mentioning that. I'll have to think of another question to ask you. Okay, so now I'd like to hand over to Abdellah, and he will be discussing the work that Sylabs does in Algeria. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Chiamaka. Hello, everyone. So my name is Abdellah Mallek. I'm the founder of Sylabs from Algeria. So I will try to find a way to talk about Sylabs story and the link that we are building into the employment programs. So when we started Sylabs, we just wanted to be like a hub that support entrepreneurs in all possible ways. But to be honest, we didn't really know how to do that. You just have to know that it was in 2015. There was no similar structure in the country except for one public incubator. So at this time, entrepreneurs had to rely on themselves, on their very basic network, to go through all the process, all the experience of launching and sustaining a business, and many failing in the process. And I will say that I had the opportunity to be one of them, and twice. So I failed two entrepreneurial experience before starting Sylabs. So when we started, we just took people in and tried to help them as much as we could. And we did that mainly during the first 3 years. We were focusing mainly on some services and programs to startups and small businesses, like business matching, training, and technical support, and we provided also a workspace. Then we had the kind of turning points. In 2018, we started our first acceleration program. The program was developed with HIVOS and other partners, and we focused on the ability of small businesses and startups to grow and to create new job opportunities. So it was, as I said, it was kind of a turning point, because when we evaluate the ability to generate and maintain sustainable jobs on the short and the long term, we started like giving an important and focusing on critical KPIs for small businesses and startups. And it was mainly related to, as I said, to growth and job creation. And it was something that it was kind of focus for us, because we had a very tight follow-up and high expectation in terms of this KPI. And through that, we were indirectly introducing the entrepreneurs. We accelerated to a sustainability mindset, and it was really great for us. But it was because it was like the first time that we were measuring our impact and the impact of our work. So yeah, and when we started more in the acceleration program, so the startups faced the reality of the job market. So they struggled to hire the right talent in some job positions, and they struggled also to keep them motivated. And this is what opened actually a new door for Sylabs, which was the young employment support. So we shortly had to face these employment problems alongside with the startups, because all their problems became ours also. So we started to develop employment programs, including soft skills training, emergent job position, like all the tech and digital jobs. And we started also doing a lot of matching campaigns between companies and candidates. We knew that the success of the small businesses supported was tightly linked to their capacity to detect and to hire and retain the right talent, and also to hire them in the right moment. So our contribution was to help them draft the perfect job description that matched with their target, and also make the hiring process in the best possible way. So after this first experience, we started more and more programs, and especially with the impact of the COVID-19 on the employment market. So we started more and more programs related to employment. So all this story is, I wanted to share with you our progressive approach that we learned by doing during like the last 6 years. And and at our level, we also are trying to create like a microclimate to the small businesses, to help them. And for example, we are creating content for the small businesses to tackling like very easily the administrative process, and the hiring also included. For example, we created a guide with orange corners that like present all the mandatory registration that a small business or an entrepreneur need to know. And yeah, so it will be more helpful, and it will help also the sustainability of the businesses. And we are doing the same for the hiring. So we developed a service of supporting SMEs in drafting clear job description, and also in having like a right and the clear process of hiring and retaining their employees. So this methodology is like it helps a lot of small businesses, and we are taking like all the burden of our startup shoulders and help them to hire fast and better, and to keep their employees. So we are not I'm not talking about like nationwide solution, but at least at Sylabs level we are trying to create solution to most common problems for young entrepreneurs. We also work to bridge the gap between the supply side and demand side in the labor market. For example, we co-created a training program with a marketing company to train job seekers in digital marketing. Like the job seekers were mainly graduated in major in which there is no opportunities, or the opportunities are very low. Yeah, and for example, for this project, after training 36 people, they were all like looking for a job since at least 3 months. So we did two batch, 36 people. 29 of them, they found a job in the next 3 months after the training, and including 6 of them who were hired by the marketing company. So we are trying to create a training program, and it's kind of new way of doing the hiring with some stakeholders in the labor market. So yeah, I'm just talking about our story and how are we doing this, but I'm not saying that we achieved like a perfect enabling environment. There is still like a huge work in terms of labor regulation, academic training, career guidance, but I think we are starting by trying to have like a deep understanding on the most hiring company in the ecosystem, and try to help the companies and the job seekers to have better opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdellah. And it's interesting to hear the work that you're doing with supporting young entrepreneurs and in Algeria, and then also the toolkit that you mentioned that was developed, the guidelines that you mentioned that was developed with Orange Corners. It'll be interesting to hear a little more about that. In terms of, you know, some of the specific information that's there. And something else that I would like you to maybe expatiate a little bit on was the last thing that you mentioned. So there seems to be a lot of focus on supporting entrepreneurs, supporting small to medium enterprises with information, guidance, etc., etc. But what are some practical things you think these young entrepreneurs would need from their governments or policymakers or even interested international partners that is outside, you know, skills building, career development, and all of that, that would actually translate to how do I put it now? That would translate to better businesses, more successful businesses, and even increased employment for young people. So that's the question I have for you.
Thank you. I think the one of the part of the answer to the second question is the first one. So I think one of the major problems that we have as young entrepreneurs is the information. So sometimes you can find some entrepreneurs that they have the ability to hire people, but just they think that because they think that it's very complicated and they need to pay like a lot of taxes, so they avoid the job creation. So for the guide we created with Orange Corners, we created a guide for the people that they want to start a business, or they already started the business. So we explain all the process of the business registration, of the taxes, how to understand all the taxes that you need to pay and you need to take in consideration. We explain also all the process of hiring. How can you have like a good process to hire people? How can you have like a good process of hiring? So yeah, so the idea is to give centralize like the information for young entrepreneurs and make it available in one place, and also in very nice place, because of course all the information that we can find it, but sometimes when we go on the website that they talk about regulation, that you find it in like in PDF, there is like 25 pages, and the most information is in like after 10 pages, so it might be very complicated to be understood. So yeah, so the guide is to give practical information, and yeah, and I think one of the added value of this project is like the guide was built by entrepreneurs. So we, of course, after building the guide, we verified all the information by for the legal aspect, but it was like built to be understood by an entrepreneur, not an accountant, not a legal guy, to have a very simple and clear information. Sorry.
No, go on. I thought you were done.
Thank you. So yeah, so for the second question, I think yeah, the first thing that we have is information. We need to give information to young entrepreneurs in a very clear way and in a very simple way. The second thing, I think it is investment, of course, because at some point, like small entrepreneurs, they start by the little funding, and at some point they need to grow. They need to go to a next stage, and this is something that we are working on, and we are trying to work on it. One of the programs that we are working is with HIVOS also, and is funded by the Dutch ministry, and we are providing support for small businesses and startups to grow. Yeah, so I think information, investment, but the investment also, I wanted to say that the investment need to be in a very specific stage, because if we give investment to a lot of on the idea stage, for example, it will be very complicated to have like the job creation and to have a very interesting growth. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Abdellah, for the answers to those questions. And then you made very important points about how information, especially in Africa, can be quite a challenge. And sometimes just providing that information is what a lot of young people would need, and then also active investment. So thank you very much. I have one question from Laila, and I think it's both a comment and a question, and it's from Lucy. But I think this relates so more to Laila's presentation. So if she can answer that, that would be great. So the question is, I see some major calls for proposals focusing on employment and even semi-employment Uber models, and less on entrepreneurship and pushing extremely high numbers of targeted beneficiaries. Is this a dangerous trend whereby little actual impact or individual empowerment is obtained? Because increased pressure for higher numbers might lead to more levels of administration in implementation and less individual attention. So I think that to summarize this question, I think that the summary of this question would be to say, is it more beneficial to focus more on employment or strengthening capacity for employment, or more on empowering individual entrepreneurship and growth for small to medium enterprises, if I may add that?
Nice question. I think, and a difficult one, I would say as well. I think synergies are extremely important, so we should be aware of fragmentation. I personally do believe that one particular program can focus on more elements, so you can try and let's say, for example, create employment, but also trying to improve a certain job and match a certain person to that job. So then you've got 3 pillars that you're tackling via one program, but not sure whether I'm answering the right question. So maybe I think the person who asked the question could elaborate a bit more what she means. If that's possible.
So would Lucy like to speak and elaborate on the question?
Yeah, I tried to unmute myself before, but it wasn't possible. Okay. Yeah, I think what I've noticed is, but there's several things, several layers in this question, so it's maybe hard to answer. On the one hand, there's increased pressure on numbers. So where you would see, I worked in Eastern Africa for 10 years, in Burundi, Eastern DRC, Rwanda, and where you would see programs before having hundreds of beneficiaries, now we're speaking of thousands. So there you see a trend of companies coming in to deliver development services. So you get these levels where you have consulting firms acting as grant managers, then outsourcing to international NGOs, who in turn outsource to national NGOs in different localities. And so there's a lot of pressure pumped down the chain. And then there's a lot of focus on reporting and data and M&Es, and very little effort going into the individual support and follow-up of the individual. So you will have programs where, for example, they target 30,000 people, but in the end, the individual attention that each of those 30,000 gets in comparison to what you would before be able to do with a program of like 200 is very different. So that's one aspect. On the other hand, I also see a lot of calls for proposals which are now more into like employment and semi-employment, and the self-employment part is a little bit, it seems to not, or entrepreneurship seems to be disappearing a little bit. Whereas I think also if we looked at the talk from the professor, is that in terms of multinational companies don't necessarily have a positive impact on employment. So it's an assumption which is sometimes put into calls whereby you see that the bigger companies have more of a chance of winning these calls because they have more capacity to give. Yeah, well, now it's maybe becoming complicated, but so we're focusing more on the bigger companies and less on the smaller companies, whereas bigger companies have other alternatives in terms of going into automation or using like international value chains, and not necessarily improving the local fabric or value chains. So there are 2 things, and I think one was more for Laila, and maybe the other one was more for the professor, but I don't know how much time we have. But and also what was said about the future of work, there's this other aspect looming on the horizon, which is artificial intelligence and all of that, which can be very well replace employment altogether. So I'm connecting a lot of dots. So I just think it's food for thought. And maybe if someone has like something to add to this, that would be great. Thanks.
Just gonna try to answer a part of your question, and then I'll give the floor to the professor for the other part. Just to tackle upon the future of work, I fully agree that that jobs will disappear, but also just to mention that new jobs will also be created, and that's something, a trend we have been seeing over the past decade as well. For example, the social media influencer, or what Abdellah said, the digital marketeer, didn't exist 20 years ago, and now it does. But that's, I think, something to deep dive further in 2 weeks' time with the next webinar. Regarding your comment on multinational corporations, I fully agree. They do not generate most of the jobs at all. I think a lot of the potential is at the MSMEs and trying to upscale the MSMEs as they have the most potential to create and generate most of the jobs. And the tendency to focus on results, that's something that we at the ministry are struggling with as well, because I fully agree with you that there is this tendency, we need to show results. We also have got our due diligence to do to the Dutch taxpayer to see how Dutch taxpaying money has been spent, and that also sometimes means we need to show results. And that's a bit of the political environment we are working and living in, which makes it a difficult battle to fight, because you want to have impact and you want to create as much decent employment as possible with a lot of impact and focusing on the individual. But that's just simply not always possible due to the tendencies we have and due to our political environment, which we should also take into account as, for example, a donor in this case. But maybe Chibuike can answer the question better from his point of view.
Thank you very much. I think I'm not sure. I'm not sure really what the question is, but what I think I want to address, and I think I've heard that especially from Lucy and now from the last speaker about the importance of the multinational sector, whether it creates the job or not. I agree with you all that it doesn't create the jobs directly, but the reality is that for you to reduce inequality, you cannot ignore the multinational sector. What I tried to show in my presentation is that if you take cash flows as a proxy, most of the cash movements is associated with multinational companies. So we have two options. Either one, see SMEs as an end in itself, which from my research, I don't see it as that way. I see it as part of a bigger picture. And I think if you see SMEs as part of the value chains of bigger things, then we begin to look at it much differently. And then is this whole argument about bottom of the pyramid. You can look at it as, okay, you want to keep the poor, the majority of the people at the bottom, that is a separate market separated from the top of the pyramid, which is dominated by SMEs. I do not agree with that. And my view is that for equality, that pyramid must be seen as one. And the bottom will have to feed the top. And that is how it works. And I've given clear examples of how this can happen. I look at, for instance, if you look at the basic thing, if you look at, for instance, Friesland Campina, for instance, it has the capacity to change the entire dairy industry in developing countries in terms of including them in the value chains of dairy, the final dairy products. If you don't do that and just see it at the bottom of the pyramid, then you miss the poverty issue. You only encourage the diversity between the rich and the poor, the gap will simply grow. So my approach and the way I want us to see it is that the key is that we must see it as one whole. And the multinationals don't exist. They provide services, but they control the bulk of the money. But the service does not start from the multinational, it starts from the value chains. And the idea must be to link the value chains to the multinationals. If you look at it that way, you will now realize that multinationals are central to this whole debate about SMEs. And it's shown if where there are big multinationals, SMEs thrive. Where they don't exist, then the bottom of the pyramid, the poverty is just concentrated there and it is left, it becomes an end in itself and it doesn't shift the kind of, doesn't lead to any improvement in standard of living, in welfare, and also in providing and in enhancing equality, which we are all striving to do. So I think we should look at it from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Chibuike, and thank you, Laila, for your responses, and thank you also to Lucy for asking the question that made us go through this debate. And something that is important and which came out very strongly as well in the last webinar is that when you have conversations about either or, it's important to understand that, especially with employment, youth employment in Africa, it's a complex and a cross-cutting problem that requires solutions that are rounded, well, robust, and consider a lot of things. So it's not going to be either one or the other. It will now be something where you look at the holistic approach, and like Chibuike mentioned, the link between the small to medium enterprises, the value chain, and the multinationals. Because in all honesty, in places where the economies are thriving, that means the multinationals are thriving, small to medium enterprises are thriving, and you can move more people away from the poverty line. So I'm glad we had that conversation because it makes us understand that, these are not very simple problems. They are complex problems and need to be looked at holistically. So we are out of time. Honestly, these webinars, we never seem to finish on time because there just seems to be so much to discuss. But I would just like some of our speakers to just maybe give us a one-line take-home. Marieke and Taonga, if they can give us, from the conversation we've had, a one-line, take home or recommendation, or maybe even a thinking point, something that we can think about, going forward in our own work. So I will start with Marieke. If you have just, one line.
Yeah. Well, one thing I like then to highlight, it relates to what you just mentioned, right? So the importance of connecting different levels, but then in that connection also to consider involving young people. So in the disconnect between supply demand, in the disconnect between different actors working on different levels, I believe really that to solve that and to work towards the enabling environment, it's key that we talk also with them. Yeah, so that would be it.
Thank you. That will always be my favorite recommendation for every webinar. Okay, and then Taonga, do you have any, just one take-home message you have? Is Taonga here?
Sorry, I was on mute. I didn't notice. What I would like to say as a take-home message is that, just in addition to what everyone has said, I would think that it's very important to continue to empower young people and youth with the necessary skills and opportunities to both improve their quality and quantity of participation in different projects and activities.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to our speakers and to the audience, everyone who participated in today's webinar. It has been a very important, insightful, and impactful discussion. And I am very happy that all of us were able to get out a lot from this discussion. So this is not the last. The final webinar will be next week. and we'll be continuing the conversation. So please register, and I would like to see everyone who participated in this webinar today next week, same time, 3:30 p.m. Dutch time. I would also like to thank Include for organizing such a great conference and meeting. Shout out to Maya, Giovanni, Siri for working very hard in the background to make this happen. Thank you everyone once again, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
All right.